Hey, my name is Edward Tapu.
And my name is Patrick Vedicat, and welcome to our Phase 3 project presentation, where we're analyzing the housing market with trends, predictability, and volatility.
So, for the introduction and why this matters, housing affordability is a critical issue affecting millions of Americans, and we wanted to understand the long-term trends of this, uh, specifically housing prices and income, and how this relates to wealth composition. And we thought this was relevant to economic discussions. What we expected to find was housing prices have been rising over time, and income growth might not be keeping pace with the housing prices, and volatility might have changed over time, and this might correlate the population with housing demand. So for our downloaded data set, it came from Zillow, where we got a CSV file with monthly, quarterly data. For web scraping, we went to the Federal Reserve, where we got household financial asset data. And finally, for the API, we went to the census, where we got median household income and population by state. And below is the example of the data frames after extraction and data cleaning.
So, for our downloaded data set from Zillow, we can see that on the bottom, like we have code where we're just finding column names, we're just replacing any values that we don't need, replacing np.nans, so just data cleaning. For the web scraping, we used Beautiful Soup, and we're searching through the headers to find our relevant columns and data, and we're extracting that into a CSV. For the census, we are parsing through all the different websites, and the piece of code that we extracted here was how we're looking for the variables and renaming them so that we can extract them later. So for our first insight, we are looking at housing price and growth acceleration, and you can see that we've had almost a $200,000 increase since 2000s, and recently we've seen a 4% growth increase also after 2021. So this is showing us how fast the housing prices are growing recently. And the method that we used in this insight was sklearn and linear regression, and we were trying to determine a relationship on the year and year on over year housing growth, and we used things like standardized with standard scaler to ensure the trend accuracy. We also used the slope and r-squared value to determine that the growth rates were accelerating over time. So for our first visualization on the right, we can see two plots that are both kind of showing how much the housing price has been increasing over the years. And specifically on the bottom plot, we see the linear regression trend and how it's increasing. So these are line plots, and we see how housing prices are rising consistently, and it's highlighting the structural price increases. So for the second insight, we are looking at the comparison between income and housing prices, and how housing prices are actually growing at a higher rate than income, and that's creating an affordability gap and kind of an increased ratio. And the method that we used for this insight was random forest regressor to kind of predict and use estimators to capture nonlinear patterns. And we also used the r-squared test to determine that the model only represents 29.3% of affordability ratio variance, so most of it is on external economic factors. So the second visualization yet again emphasizes this, that housing growth is increasing at a far higher rate than income growth, and so we're seeing that gap in affordability, and it reveals a persistent income price gap contributing to a long-term housing strain. So our third insight has to do with population growth and how it has a weak correlation with housing prices. So we initially thought that the population growth in certain areas would increase demand and housing prices would go up, but we actually see through our Pearson correlation that is a really weak fit, and also with our linear regression that it's a really weak fit. So the method that we used for this was the Pearson correlation, of course, and we also applied the simple linear regression to validate the population growth predictability. We interpreted correlation thresholds to determine relationship was positive, negative, or weak.
So for Insight 4, we saw how the housing was, if it was increasing or decreasing as a share of the total household wealth. And we found, this was post-COVID, and we found that the financial assets were growing 5 times faster than the housing prices. We found the housing growth year over year, housing asset growth year over year, and then how this share fluctuated, which was a decrease. And so the key method that we used was we found the percent change from each year to each year, and then we standardized this to find the housing index and the asset index and how these fluctuated over time, and then like a share trend, seeing how much the housing is and if assets are growing faster. And then for our third visualization, we have housing, and we see that it's a decreasing share of household wealth. We use a scatter plot for this with trend lines, and we're comparing the financial and asset growth. We can see from this that the financial assets are growing much faster than the housing value assets, and the relative share has declined since 2022. And this indicates that a wealth accumulation is shifting away from real estate and more towards the financial assets. And then finally, for our fifth insight, we see that the market volatility has increased. So we wanted to see how this volatility was changing year over year in more earlier years compared to later years. And we did this using the standard deviation of the early period, which we defined as 2000 to 2010, and then the more recent period, which is 2021 to 2025. We saw that we compared these two standard deviations, and we saw that the housing market is more volatile today, which means less stability. And so we compared these. We see the market has become more unstable in recent years. So some key finding and conclusions is housing prices have grown 178% since 2000, with more growth in the recent years. Housing prices grow faster than income, which makes pressure on the affordability, and assets are growing faster than housing. Population growth has weak correlation with housing, which is contrary to what we thought before, and market volatility has slightly increased since the past.
So also broader implications, we see that affordability challenges are going to continue over time, and we also see that the wealth inequality may widen because the share of household wealth that real estate is taking is decreasing over time, and that the housing market is really dependent on a lot of other external economic factors that we didn't look at, unlike population and income. So just looking at our overall experience with this project, we got to interact with a lot of new things like APIs. We never really worked with a large API like the census data before, so handling that was cool. Using sklearn for the first time in application was interesting to see how we could use linear regression and random forest regressor to kind of draw insights, and just also dealing with all these data sets and merging them and how we can interact with them was really cool. So thank you for listening, and appreciate your time.